F1 drivers aren't usually united about much, but they seem united in their disdain for the current FIA president, Mohammed Ben Sulayem. They've issued a strongly worded joint statement through the GPDA criticising basically the FIA president and his style. So, what the hell's going on with this, Scott?
Yeah, this is the F1 drivers taking a stand, effectively a public stand, against driver misconduct, which basically means swearing, and the ridiculous circus that emerged in September around the Singapore Grand Prix weekend about Ben Sulayem's desire to clamp down on swearing in Formula One, and Max Verstappen was kind of the first role model held up for breaching the standards of being said role model in for swearing in the Singapore press conference there. So the drivers have taken an issue with this. A lot of people have, but they've taken their time to come back with what we now see as this Grand Prix Drivers Association statement. It is basically the F1 drivers' way of fighting fire with fire. Ben Sulayem and the FIA decided to make a point of this, make a public example of Verstappen. Charles Leclerc since got a penalty as well for swearing. So they've decided, well, you're the ones that have brought this into the public eye, so we will deal with this in the public eye. It's very much if we will give as good as we get, and it puts the ball back into Ben Sulayem's court on how to respond.
Yeah, the more you study this statement, the more it seems there is to unpick. There are so many middle fingers being issued from the drivers to Ben Sulayem, and it's him specifically they seem to be taking issue with here, Scott. You know, obviously they're upset with the swearing ban, such as it is, but there's a lot more to this too, isn't there?
Yeah, the language used is quite telling. You know, if we put the statement on screen and highlight a few things, they've urged the FIA president to consider his own tone and language, which I think is very significant because Ben Sulayem is the one driving this. This is his crusade to clamp down on what he thinks is a very big problem. But he is one of the most likely figures in and around F1 to cause controversy by his words, by what he says and how he says it. So the GPDA is kind of turning the table there effectively and almost exposing the president's hypocrisy in that regard. But there's also other references. They've expressed the fact that the members are adults, that they don't need to be reminded about jewelry and underpants. Remember that whole saga, which feels like an eternity ago, and they don't need to find out about this stuff through the media or whatever. And obviously, implication there is that they're not being treated like adults. If you're not being treated like an adult, you must be being treated like a child, which is a sort of implied accusation towards the president and the FIA as well. And they then go on to express their displeasure with fines and lack of transparency. But at the very end of the statement, they come back to the president again because they stress the desire to collaborate in a constructive way with everybody, including the FIA president. So the fact that they felt the need to go back to Ben Sulayem just really underlines kind of who this is aimed at and where it's come from. But it was a very strongly worded statement. Clearly, a lot of time and effort has gone into getting this right. And I did wonder if that would eventually lead to something a bit more watered down, but I don't think they've pulled any punches here.
No, they've gone absolutely flat out, haven't they? I think there seems like this kind of almost explosion of vitriol at how they've been treated. I think the reference to feeling like they've been treated like children. I mean, they say that they should be treated like adults, so the implication is they feel like they're being treated like children at the moment. I feel that's quite telling, but they also veer off into other areas. You know, you mentioned money. They seem very unhappy with this idea that drivers can be fined for swearing, as Charles Leclerc was after the Brazilian Grand Prix, and they question why this is being done and also where the money is going. So, do they have a point here? Is the FIA? I mean, they used Ben Sulayem's transparency drive against him and say that there should be more transparency over where the money's going. So, do they have a point with that?
Yeah, it's a good point. You know, I said about you know turning the turning Ben Sulayem's tone on himself and his choice of language, but as you say, it's also the transparency thing as well. So if Ben Sulayem is all about transparency and no abuse and tolerance, and that's what his presidency is built around, then basically the GPDA is saying, well, back it up. Show us. Don't just speak it or claim it. Actually, give us some action. So this obviously isn't about the this isn't a bit woe is me from the drivers, these poor millionaires having to shell out a few hundred euros here and there for speeding fines. It's about a bigger picture than that. Just as an example, I think this year there have been over 200,000 euros issued in terms of fines. It's 230,000 euros. Just over 30,000 of that is suspended, but the vast majority of that is from the teams. I think it's only around 70,000 euros has been paid by drivers, and again, some of that is, or I think nearly half of that has been suspended so far. So it's not specifically about why are you taking money out of our wallets, because I think F1 drivers would be somewhere near the bottom of the list of people who are actually allowed to complain about that kind of thing. I think reading between the lines, this is targeted about something else, which is okay, if you're going to fine us for swearing, amongst other things, but if there's going to be a tangible penalty for this, where's that going? Who is deciding where that goes, and why can't we all know where that goes? I don't know about you, Ben, but for me, the it's one of the age-old questions of modern motorsport, which is where do all the FIA fines go? And there's this kind of semi-jokey perception that it funds the Christmas party and stuff like that. But I think there is a very serious undercurrent in this point, which is Ben Sulayem came into the presidency talking a lot about the financial crisis he'd supposedly inherited from his predecessor Jean Todt, and has constantly talked about the need to basically improve the FIA's financial situation. The implication from what the GPDA is saying here is, okay, is this a legitimate use of our money, taking our money, or is this just, boosting the FIA's position? Where's it going? Is it because it needs to basically be reinvested into sensible areas? I think that's what they're saying here, and the implication is they might not think that it is.
Yeah, well, when McLaren were fined $100 million, I think it was, for Spygate, nearly 20 years ago now, there was a big thing about that fund being used to develop grassroots. There were very specific points that a whole body was set up to manage that money and make sure it was used in a positive way that everybody knew about and was transparent. And it's a good point that actually, whether the amounts in this case are now trifling or not, we don't really know. It's so opaque. All this money is being collected, but what is it being used for? That seems like a legitimate question. But it was a strange one for me to come out of a statement that was much more focused on recent events, the swearing ban and how the president is conducting himself. So it almost feels like the drivers have reached this tipping point where they've been picked at over the last few years, little things. And this is like, I guess, the straw that broke the camel's back. And now they're going in two-footed.
Yeah, well, it does feel that this is kind of an accumulation of various issues, and it's all condensed into one unified reaction. Because what the GPDA doesn't want to do is start issuing. They've got their nice new Instagram account now, but they don't want to be putting out statements every single week, every time one of their drivers feels picked on or anything like that. It's not juvenile like that. This is a coordinated, organized response to something serious. And I like it because it does show that the drivers inherently, when there's like a core issue involving all of them, they do effectively have one another's back. I don't think anybody really thought Verstappen had been treated fairly around the Singapore thing, even though there's a lot of people who think this kind of idea in principle is fine to clamp down on swearing. You've just gone about it in such a ham-fisted way. But you look at where the FIA is at now in terms of the drivers. You've got Verstappen, who obviously felt victimised over the swearing thing, especially when initially he thought Leclerc had got away with swearing in the Mexico press conference. Then Leclerc got a slightly different penalty to Verstappen. He didn't get the community service. That was because Verstappen basically, and producer Luke, I'm sorry, I don't want to get my own community service for this, so I'm going to need him to come in and censor me here. Verstappen had said "fucking" in relation to I think it was "fucked" in relation to the
That's right.
performance of his car, the quality of where his car was at. Leclerc, so it was almost like a gratuitous bit of swearing. That's how it was seen. Whereas Leclerc was asked specifically what was going through your head. And clearly what was going through his head was a swear word, because as part of his answer, he was just like, and then he realised that he had swore, blah, blah, blah. So there ended up, he was apologetic in the moment, so they took a slightly different action. But you've got Max's sort of general feeling at the moment, the feeling that there's some British bias against him. A lot of that comes down to stewarding and officiating. It's not just the media, even though obviously he's directed some of it there. You've got other elements as well, like stewarding decisions, track limits, that kind of thing. You've had the swearing gate as a whole, and Ben Sulayem getting involved again. GPDA have brought up older issues like jewelry and underpants, for example. So it feels like we've gone back to that again, like 18 months ago or so, where it was like all these issues felt dormant for a really long time, and it felt like there was almost peace between F1 and the FIA. Now it feels like FIA and FOM, Formula One management itself, are on better grounds, but now the FIA is fighting another war with its drivers, or an emerging war with its drivers on a whole host of issues. And I think that's what is kind of behind where we're at now. There's a lot of disagreement and dissatisfaction with how things are being done. And the GPDA have decided enough's enough. We need to make our feelings felt right now.
Yeah, I mean that dissatisfaction that's been bubbling under for a long time, hasn't it? Not just with the drivers. I mean, the teams as well haven't had much faith in the FIA, and it felt more to me like a ceasefire rather than a peace, because we hadn't really heard from the president and the FIA on these kind of broader topics for quite a while, and then he kind of re-emerged with this specific swearing thing, and it's just brought everything back to the surface again. And I think that's kind of reminded everybody that they don't like his interventions, and then it's almost like, oh, and this thing and another thing. But of course it then begs the question, how will he react? Because it seems to me that in the past, when he's been criticised, whether it's in the media, for whatever reason, he gets quite defensive and almost doubles down on his points. He doesn't seem to have the sort of, magnanimous, self-reflective quality that you might expect of a president or some presidents. So how do you think it's going to play out from here? Do you think he's going to be contrite and take this letter on the chin and work out a different way of speaking and acting in front of the drivers, or do you expect kind of just more blows to be exchanged?
History would tell us it could go either way, because as you mentioned there, he did back away for a while, and there wasn't that kind of running sequence of him mistakenly tweeting or doing an interview where he said something ridiculous or controversial, because he has a knack of generating his own problems and the FIA's own problems and F1's own problems, even though he does, as you say, like to get defensive and blame other people for it. So we've seen both sides of him in terms of that response in the past. I think it's pretty critical that he responds to this carefully, that he doesn't escalate it further, and that he heeds what is in the GPDA statement. Because what the F1 drivers are doing by saying what they've said is basically bringing public, a long-standing issue within the F1 paddock, but also, as far as I can understand it, people within the FIA as well. Not everybody in the FIA, or even in Ben Sulayem's, employ, basically agree with his policies, much less his tactics of trying to enforce them. So he just stands to lose a lot more than he stands to gain if he continues down this path on this collision course with significant groups. And the F1 drivers are about as significant a group as it gets in motorsport in terms of, from the competitors' side. So he really needs to heed this. It's not about threat and counter threat. It's not about who's got the power, who doesn't. It's about what's best for F1, the FIA, motorsport as a whole. And when you've got a combative president who can't take criticism, likes to point the finger, and then doesn't like kind of being exposed for that, that isn't healthy. So he really does need to consider his response carefully. If he doesn't, and he shoots from the hip, this is going to get worse before it ever has chance of getting better.